Hello folks, this is John again, and today I would like to talk to you about latency. Not as easy of a subject as you would believe. So, here is what I was thinking about lately and the gripes I kind of got. You know how manufacturers of audio interfaces like to promote their gear and advertise their interfaces by using slogans like zero latency direct monitoring or super low latency below 1 millisecond. Now, I'm thinking, how much meaning does that really have? Usually what those numbers would mean is the lowest latency you can possibly get with that interface by using direct monitoring. That means a signal goes straight into an input and goes through the device straight through to the output. That is direct monitoring. And yes, the latencies can get very low in that process, but how much does that really matter? See, I'm speaking from the perspective of the home recording guy. I record guitar through my interface into the computer and then I use amp modeling software. How much does direct monitoring matter? I tell you, it doesn't matter at all. At all. Because I don't want to hear the DI coming out of the speakers. That is what I would be hearing if I would use direct monitoring. The guitar signal goes into the interface straight back through the outputs. That's the DI signal. I don't want to hear that. Why would I? I want to hear the guitar sound. And what that means, the signal of the guitar has to go from the interface to the computer. It has to be processed. It's being sent back to the interface and then through the output. And that takes quite a bit more time than direct monitoring. And this is called round trip latency. The signal going the complete loop, that whole round, and then going out through the speakers. That is what we need to concern ourselves with. So all the marketing with zero latency or whatnot is completely pointless for that. Because round trip latency is not determined really by the device. Of course, you can add a little bit to it because of the analog digital conversions and whatnot, but the biggest chunk of that round trip latency is determined by your CPU power, by the way you set the buffer size, and by the plugins you use and how big the projects are. All of that stuff can add to latency. That is when we need to concern ourselves with, really. That's the most important thing. Even if you wanted to record vocals, of course, yes, you could use direct monitoring. You hear yourself directly in the speakers. Let's say you wanted to hear your voice with the effects on that. Then you would have to turn off direct monitoring and use the monitoring in your DAW. And there, round trip latency becomes the issue again. Now the next thing about that round trip latency is very often you hear or you read at about, well, give or take 5 milliseconds, you can start to feel the lag between what you're doing and what's coming out of the speakers. And I'm wondering, is that really the case? I want to really find out for myself what kind of latency values I am dealing with here in my recording setup. So I set up an experiment. I'm going to show you that experiment in real time in a little bit, in which I will measure the latency of my system and see what I'm actually working with here. Because at this point I also don't have any problems with latency. So I want to see, well, what kind of latencies am I actually getting? And yes, there is software that could do that, but I read different softwares give you varying results. So there would be a little bit of guesswork in that. I want to do it a little bit more reliably. So I build up a setup that I can see the actual latency I'm getting and show it to you, and then perhaps shed a little light on the whole subject. So let's get to it. Okay, first of all, let me explain to you the setup here for this test. It's actually pretty simple. It may be a little bit more complicated to explain than it actually is. So here's my usual recording setup. I just have my mic plugged into the input of my interface that is going to the computer and also to my speakers. Although my speakers are turned off right now. They don't really have a part in this whole thing. So I'm just going to clap. I'm just going to make one clap into the mic. That signal is going to the interface. There's being converted into digital, then it goes to the computer, and it's being recorded. All fine and well. Now to see the latency, what time it takes for it to actually reach the speakers, I'm going to turn on the monitoring in my DAW. So that means from my computer, the signal is going back to the interface, and then I made this little loop here from an extra output back into an extra line input, and from there it gets sent back to the PC, and there it's being recorded again. And between those two recordings, I will have my round trip latency. Now, just to cover all the details in this whole process, one thing that is not really considered in this whole thing is the analog to digital conversion going on here in the preamp. That is being lost because the computer is recording after everything is being converted and sent to it. But then again, here's the thing, usually your whole signal chain would just end here. This loop you wouldn't do here, it would just go straight into the speakers. But because we make that loop, we have that extra conversion going on back here. And that is being taken into account again in the second recording. So while we don't have the conversion directly from the mic, we do have it here in the back. So it's kind of being shifted. Instead of having that latency, that extra latency right at the beginning, it is added to the end. Although then again, that conversion happens so super duper fast, I'm not sure if we really have to consider ourselves with that. I don't want to be scientifically and surgically accurate with this. I just want to have my rough numbers. I mean, between 5 milliseconds and 10 milliseconds is a pretty big gap. Okay, those are the numbers I'm looking at. Okay, so here we are with our mic input right here. So this is already set to recording, and of course the line input we also need to record. As you can see, there's still nothing happening here. Usually we want this to record at the same time as this, so something must be not quite right here yet. So let's check this. First of all, I kind of want to measure the direct monitoring inside the interface. So for that, what I need to do is to unmute the mic. And now we can see on both these tracks I have my peaks. That is what I want. And I set the latency here to 2 milliseconds. Let's see if the direct monitoring is actually 2 milliseconds or what that number there really means. And to double check, let's go into the options here in Studio One. So here we have a buffer size of 89 samples. So 2 milliseconds in the Scala mix control actually means a buffer size of 89 samples. Okay, that is a pretty low setting. That is a pretty low latency as well. Let's see what's going on in direct monitoring. I'm just going to hit record, clap, and then we'll see. And there we are. Let's shove that here to the 10 second thing. You know what, okay, we can see it's different volumes. That's not a big deal. This is not about volume matching. This is about time. So let's just shift the first peak here right at the 10-second mark. Now here we can see on the second track, you can see the latency going on, and that is about here, the first peak. And you can also see, because of the sample rate of the recording, the waveforms are not quite identical, but that's no biggie. So here's 10 seconds, here's 10.001 seconds. That means this marker here marks 1 millisecond. 1 millisecond. Look where that peak is. It's not at 1 millisecond, it's even before that. It's like, here's 0.5, 6, 7. This is about 0.6, let's say 0.65 milliseconds. We have a direct monitoring latency of 0.65 milliseconds. So what does that 2 milliseconds here mean? I'll be honest, I don't know. I have no idea. Okay, but here we can see the direct monitoring, really, it's so fast. Do we really need to take it into consideration when we are looking for a new audio interface? I'm using a first generation Scarlett interface. That model is already a couple of years old, and look at what kind of values this is giving me. We don't really need to concern ourselves with latencies here anymore. The technology is at a point where it's just good. It's not a problem anymore. It used to be a problem. That's why the manufacturers are still marketing with that latency issue. But it's really not an issue anymore. But again, now this was direct monitoring. Now I want to look at the round trip monitoring. So let's just go to this 50-second mark here. Now let's go back to the Scarlett Mix Control. I want to turn off direct monitoring. Let's mute that. Okay, now I turn on the monitoring here, my dear W. And now I will be having my round trip latency. Let's check this out. Okay, here we have our clap again. Let's put that as closely as possible to that 50 seconds mark here. Okay. Oopsala. Okay. Now that's when we can boost the volume a little bit again, so we can see the spike more clearly. Now here we can already see this is a bigger latency. But what do we really have? So here's 15 seconds. Here's 15.1. That means that's 100 milliseconds. Let's zoom in. 10 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds. Zoom in some more. 12 milliseconds, 13 milliseconds. Zoom in some more. Here's 12.5. So this is not quite 12.5. Like 12.45 something. Now that's interesting, isn't it? I have a latency here of about 12.5 milliseconds. Let's just round roughly. 12.5 milliseconds of a round trip latency. At the buffer size of, what do we have here? 89 samples. And here in the settings, also set pretty low. I have a complete latency of 12.5 milliseconds. So that is the setting I also work with. I record with that. And you know what? I don't feel any lag between my playing and what's coming out of the speakers. I can work with that without any problems at 12.5 milliseconds. So where is that all coming from? Here we can see the input latency and the output latency. Look at the numbers, 5.37 milliseconds and 7.39 milliseconds. You know what? Let's put that together. We got 5.3. 7 plus 7.39, that gives us 12.76 milliseconds. So that's coming a bit closer to what we are seeing here. The slightest bit of difference there still is, I don't know, could be measuring errors, could be in the system, I have no idea. And you also often hear people saying, at a latency of about 5 milliseconds you start to feel that lag. I already talked about that before. Well, where are people getting that from? Perhaps they are just seeing the input latency. Or perhaps they are also mistaking the plugin latency for that. See down here, this value, the 0.0 milliseconds, is telling me how much the plugins I use add to the latency. Right now it's at 0 because there are no plugins here in this project. This is just completely empty. In my bigger projects, this adds about 4.4 milliseconds, 4.5 milliseconds, and I still don't have any trouble. So yeah, here are my measurements to back up what I'm saying. As you can see, I'm not pulling this out of my hair anywhere. This right here is real physical stuff. And I'm not quite sure where I could have gone wrong in my setup or in my logic, if there are any flaws. The way I see it, this right here is the real deal. And there we have it. I think for us home recording guys, the latency of the interface that's being marketed so prominently is absolutely not the issue here. We really have to concern ourselves with the round trip latency, and that's been determined by quite different factors. How it is for professional studios, I don't know. That's a completely different subject. It could be for recording drums, you actually do need the lowest latency you could possibly get because you have clear transients. That may be more noticeable. But for recording guitars or vocals, that 12 milliseconds is really not noticeable. I'm not noticing anything that's obstructing my recording or my performance at all. So I hope I could clear up a few misconceptions about latency. We can see it's determined by a lot of factors. not just by the value the manufacturers give you. And also the latencies we work with are not what we think they are. They are actually higher. This experiment was for me personally also quite interesting. And with this we come to the end of this video. I hope you liked it and enjoyed it and learned something. Please leave a like and a comment and subscribe, and I will see you next time.